Sarah Martinez had been dreaming of visiting London for 20 years. As a schoolteacher from Ohio, she had saved every penny for this once-in-a-lifetime trip. On her third day in the city, she decided to visit Buckingham Palace, the crown jewel of British royalty. The morning was crisp and clear as Sarah joined the crowd of tourists gathering outside the palace gates. She clutched her camera tightly, determined to capture every moment. The majestic building stood before her like something from a fairy tale, with its grand facade and perfectly manicured gardens. As she moved closer to get a better view, Sarah noticed the famous royal guards standing at their posts. These weren't just any guards, they were the Queen's Guard. Dressed in their iconic red tunics and tall black bearskin hats. She had read about them before her trip, learning that they were real soldiers with an important job protecting the royal family. Sarah raised her camera to take a photo when something caught her attention. One of the guards, a young man with kind eyes visible beneath his hat, seemed different from the others, while his fellow guards stared straight ahead with stone-cold expressions. This guard occasionally glanced at the tourists with what seemed like gentle curiosity, excited by this unique opportunity. Sarah stepped backward to frame the perfect shot. She wanted to capture not just the guard, but also the beautiful palace architecture behind him. As she looked through her camera viewfinder, she took another step back, then another. What happened next changed everything. Sarah's foot caught on an uneven stone in the pavement. She stumbled backward, her arms flailing as she tried to regain her balance. Her camera flew from her hands. She crashed directly into the royal guard she had been photographing. The collision was spectacular. The guard, caught completely off guard, despite his training, stumbled forward. His tall bearskin hat toppled from his head and rolled across the cobblestones. Sarah landed in a heap at his feet, her face burning with embarrassment as dozens of tourists turned to stare. For a moment, time seemed frozen. The other guards remained motionless at their posts, but Sarah could feel the weight of their attention. The tourist crowd had gone silent, phones and cameras now pointed at her instead of the palace. She had become the unwanted center of attention. In the most embarrassing way possible, the guard she had knocked into looked down at her, with surprise written across his face. His carefully maintained composure had cracked, revealing a very human expression of confusion and concern. This wasn't something they covered in guard training. Sarah's cheeks turned red as she realized what she had done. She had disturbed a royal guard during his duty. She had probably broken some ancient British law. Maybe she would be arrested. Maybe she would be banned from the country. Her dream vacation was turning into a nightmare. "Oh my goodness, I am so sorry," she exclaimed, scrambling to get up from the ground. Her voice carried clearly across the silent courtyard, and she immediately wished she could take the words back. Speaking to a guard on duty was probably another rule she had broken, as Sarah struggled to stand. Brushing dirt from her clothes and looking around desperately for her camera, she caught the guard's eye, instead of the anger or annoyance. She expected to see there was something else entirely, something that would lead to the most unexpected encounter of her entire trip. The royal guard looked at Sarah with an expression she never expected to see, concern mixed with something that almost looked like amusement. His name was James Mitchell, though Sarah didn't know that yet. He'd been serving as a Queen's Guard for 2 years, and in all that time, nothing like this had ever happened. James had been watching Sarah take photos for several minutes before the accident. He had noticed how excited she seemed, how carefully she was trying to capture the perfect shot. Unlike many tourists who treated the guards like statues in a museum, she had looked at him like he was a real person. That small recognition had touched him more than he cared to admit. Now, as she scrambled to apologize, James found himself in an impossible situation. Royal guards were trained never to break character, never to speak while on duty, and certainly never to engage with tourists. They were supposed to be living statues, symbols of British tradition and discipline. But looking at Sarah's mortified face, James felt something stir in his chest. She wasn't trying to be disrespectful or cause trouble. She was genuinely sorry, and her embarrassment was so obvious that he felt bad for her. "Please don't worry about it," James said quietly. His voice barely audible to anyone but Sarah. The words slipped out before he could. "Stop them. Sarah's eyes widened in shock. Had the guard actually spoken to her? She looked around nervously, expecting someone to come running over to arrest them both, but the other guards remained perfectly still, though she noticed one of them seemed to be fighting back a smile. James quickly bent down to retrieve his bearskin hat while Sarah spotted her camera a few feet away. Thankfully, it wasn't broken, though it had a small scratch on the side. As James placed his hat back on his head, he caught Sarah's eye again. "Are you hurt?" he whispered, so quietly that only she could hear. No, I'm fine," Sarah whispered back, her heart racing. She couldn't believe this was happening, "but I'm so sorry I knocked you over. I didn't mean to cause trouble." James straightened his red tunic and adjusted his position, trying to return to his proper stance. But he couldn't help glancing at Sarah one more time. There was something about her genuine kindness that made him want to break every protocol he had been taught. The crowd of tourists had begun to disperse, assuming the show was over. Most of them had gotten their photos of the clumsy American tourist and were moving on to other attractions. But Sarah remained frozen in place, unsure of what to do next. Should she walk away and pretend nothing happened? Should she apologize? Again? She had never been in a situation like this before. She certainly hadn't expected to have a conversation with a royal guard. James was struggling with his own internal battle. Every rule he had learned told him to ignore Sarah completely, to stare straight ahead and pretend she didn't exist. But his human instincts told him something entirely different. As Sarah finally started to back away, ready to disappear into the crowd and forget about her embarrassing moment, James made a decision that would change both of their lives. He did. Something that no royal guard had ever done before while on duty at Buckingham Palace. Something so unexpected that even Sarah, with all her American optimism and friendliness, never saw it coming. James smiled. It wasn't a big smile, and it only lasted for a split second. But it was real, warm, and directed straight at Sarah. In that moment, the serious royal guard disappeared, and Sarah saw the kind young man beneath the uniform. That tiny smile hit Sarah like lightning. She had traveled thousands of miles, too. See the sights of London. But suddenly, nothing seemed more important than this unexpected human connection with someone she was never supposed to meet. Sarah spent the rest of that day thinking about the guard's smile. She visited Westminster Abbey and rode the London Eye. But her mind kept drifting back to those few seconds of human connection outside Buckingham Palace. She had never experienced anything like it before. That evening, sitting in her small hotel room, Sarah made an unusual decision. Instead of planning her next day of sightseeing, she found herself researching the Queen's Guard online. She learned that they were real soldiers, not just ceremonial figures. They worked long shifts in all kinds of weather, standing perfectly still while tourists took photos and sometimes tried to make them laugh or react. She discovered that the guards changed. Shifts at specific times each day. The ceremony was called the Changing of the Guard, and it happened every other day at 11:30 in the morning. Sarah realized that if she wanted to see James again, though she still didn't know his name, she would need to figure out his schedule. Next morning, Sarah returned to Buckingham Palace earlier than most tourists. She positioned herself where she could watch the guards without being obvious about it. When James appeared for his shift, her heart skipped a beat. Even from a distance, she recognized his kind eyes and the way he carried himself. For 2 hours, Sarah pretended to be a normal tourist. She took photos of other things, bought souvenirs, and even joined a guided tour group. But her attention never left James. She noticed how professional he was, how he never moved or reacted, no matter what tourists did around him. But she also noticed something else. Every so often, when he thought no one was looking, James would scan the crowd. And when his eyes found Sarah, there was that same brief, almost invisible smile. This went on for 3 days. Sarah would arrive early, spend time near the palace, and share these tiny moments of connection with James. They never spoke again. But somehow they had developed a silent communication, a glance here, a barely perceptible nod there. It was like they were sharing a wonderful secret that no one else knew about. On the 4th day, something changed. Sarah arrived at her usual time, but James wasn't at his regular post. A different guard stood in his place, someone she had never seen before. Sarah felt a strange sense of loss, wondering if James had been transferred to a different location or if his shift schedule had changed. She was about to leave when she noticed a small piece of paper tucked under a stone near where James usually stood. It seemed out of place, and Sarah's curiosity got the better of her. Looking around to make sure no one was watching, she carefully retrieved the paper. Her hands trembled as she unfolded it. In neat handwriting, someone had written, "Tea shop. On Victoria Street, 3 p.m. today. If you're interested in hearing a proper apology for the other day." Sarah's heart raced. James had left her a note. A royal guard had broken protocol not just once, but multiple times, all because of their accidental meeting. She knew this was probably against every rule in the book, but she also knew she had to go. The rest of the morning passed in a blur. Sarah tried to eat lunch, but could barely taste her food. She changed clothes 3 times, unsure what was appropriate for having tea with a royal guard. Was this even really happening? At exactly 3 p.m., Sarah pushed open the door to the small tea shop on Victoria Street. It was cozy and warm, filled with the scent of fresh scones and Earl Grey tea. She looked around nervously, wondering if she had misunderstood the note. Then she saw him. James sat at a corner table, dressed in civilian clothes, jeans, and a simple sweater. Without his red uniform and tall hat, he looked like any other young man in London. But when he stood up and smiled at her, Sarah recognized those same kind eyes that had looked at her with such concern after their collision. "I wasn't sure you'd come," James said, his voice nervous but hopeful. "I wasn't sure I should," Sarah admitted, taking the seat across from him. "Is this going to get you in trouble?" James laughed, and the sound was warm and genuine. "Probably, but some things are worth the risk." As they sat down to tea, both of them knew that this meeting would change everything. What had started as an embarrassing accident was becoming something neither of them had expected to find in London. The tea shop felt like a different world from the formal atmosphere of Buckingham Palace. James and Sarah sat across from each other, both feeling nervous but excited. For the first time, they could have a real conversation without worrying about protocols or tourists watching. "I should properly introduce myself," James said, extending his hand. "James Mitchell. And I owe you an apology for not catching you when you fell." Sarah laughed, shaking his hand. "Sarah Martinez. And you definitely don't owe me an apology. I'm the one who crashed into you like a bowling ball." "You weren't that bad," James said with a grin. "I've seen much worse tourist disasters. Last month, someone tried to climb the palace fence to get a selfie with us. That didn't end well." They talked. Sarah learned that James was 26 years old, originally from a small town in Yorkshire. He had joined the army straight out of school and had worked his way up to become one of the Queen's Guard. It was an honor he took seriously. But it also meant giving up a lot of normal life. "Can't date while we're on active duty at the palace," James explained, stirring sugar into his tea. "Too many security concerns, they say? We definitely can't fraternize with tourists. What I'm doing right now could get me dismissed from the Guard." "Then why are you here?" Sarah asked, genuinely curious. James was quiet for a moment, considering his answer. "'Cause in 2 years of standing at that post, no one has ever looked at me the way you did. Most tourists see us as decorations, like we're not real people. But when you fell, and when you apologized, you looked at me like I mattered. Like I was human." Sarah felt her cheeks warm. "Of course you're human. You're doing an incredibly difficult job, standing perfectly still for hours, dealing with all kinds of weather, having people try to make you react all the time. Know how you do it." "Most days I remind myself that I'm protecting something important," James said. "The royal family, British tradition, history. But some days it feels like being a living statue. Until this week, when I started looking forward to seeing you in the crowd." They spent the next 2 hours talking about everything. Sarah told James about her life as a teacher, about her students who were studying British history and would never believe she was having tea with a real royal guard. James shared stories about his training, the funny things tourists did, and how he had always dreamed of traveling but had never left England. "Where would you go if you could go anywhere?" Sarah asked. America, actually, James said with a shy smile. I've always been curious about it, especially the Midwest, where you're from. It seems so different from London. Ohio isn't exactly exciting, Sarah laughed. But I'd love to show you around sometime. The students would go crazy meeting a real Queen's Guard. The words hung in the air between them, both realizing what Sarah had just implied. She was suggesting he'd visit her in America, as if they would stay in touch after her vacation ended. As if this was the beginning of something rather than just a one-time meeting. Sarah, James said quietly, I need to tell you something. My posting here ends in 3 months. I'm being transferred to a regular army unit after that. I'll finally be able to have a normal life again. Sarah's heart skipped. What does that mean? It means that in 3 months, I won't be bound by all these rules anymore. I could travel, date, make my own choices about who I spend time with. He paused, looking directly into her eyes. If you were interested, maybe we could figure out a way to see each other again. Sarah stared at him, hardly believing what she was hearing. You mean like stay in touch? After I go back to Ohio? I mean exactly that. I know it sounds crazy. We just met and we live on different continents. But I haven't been able to stop thinking about you since Tuesday. And judging by the fact that you came back to the palace every day this week, maybe you've been thinking about me too. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. She had come to London expecting to see historic sights and take photos. She never expected to meet someone who would make her question everything about her quiet life back home. I have been thinking about you, she admitted. Every day. But James, this is so complicated. Your job, the distance, everything. The best things in life usually are complicated, James said, reaching across the table to gently touch her hand. But they're also worth fighting for. As they sat in that cozy tea shop, both of them realized that what had started as an accident was becoming something much more significant than either had imagined. Sarah's remaining days in London passed like a dream. She and James found ways to meet secretly each evening after his duties ended. They walked along the Thames, visited quiet pubs where no one would recognize him, and talked for hours about their hopes, dreams, and fears. James showed her parts of London that tourists never see: hidden gardens, historic pubs tucked away in narrow alleys, and viewpoints where they could watch the city lights twinkle at night. Sarah felt like she was seeing the real London, not just the tourist version. It was more beautiful than anything in her guidebooks. But with each passing day, the reality of her situation became harder to ignore. Sarah's return flight was booked for Sunday, just 3 days away. She had used up all her vacation days and spent most of her savings on this trip. Going back to Ohio meant returning to her job, her small apartment, and her predictable life. The thought of leaving James behind felt like losing something precious before she had really gotten to know what it was. On Thursday evening, as they sat in their favorite corner of a quiet pub, James brought up the subject they had both been avoiding. I've been thinking about what happens when you leave, he said, turning his beer glass around in his hands nervously. 3 days isn't much time, I know, Sarah said quietly. I've been trying not to think about it. What if you didn't leave? Question hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they should cross. Sarah looked at James with surprise and something that might have been hope. What do you mean? What if you stayed in London? Extended your trip, found a way to remain here, while I finish my last 3 months with the Guard? James's voice was urgent now, as if he was afraid to stop speaking before he got all the words out. I know it sounds crazy, and I know we've only known each other for a week, but Sarah, I've never felt this way about anyone before. Sarah's heart was racing. James, I can't just stay in London. I have a job, responsibilities. I can't afford to be unemployed in a foreign country for 3 months. I have some money saved up, James said quickly. Could help with expenses. Until I'm transferred and we figure out what comes next. I know it's a huge risk, and I'm asking a lot. But, ... But what? Sarah asked, though she thought she knew what he was going to say. But I think I'm falling in love with you, James said simply. And I think maybe you feel the same way. Sarah felt tears well up in her eyes. She did feel the same way. This week, with James, had been the most alive she had felt in years. Back home, her life was safe and predictable, but it was also lonely. She went to work, graded papers, watched television, and went to bed. She had friends, but no one special. No one who looked at her the way James did. "I do feel the same way," she whispered. "But James, this is terrifying. What if we're just caught up in the romance of the situation? What if this is just a vacation fling that feels more serious than it really is?" James reached across the table and took her hands in his. "Look at me, Sarah. Does this feel like a vacation fling to you?" Sarah looked into his eyes and saw something deep and real there. It wasn't just attraction or the excitement of a forbidden romance. It was genuine care, affection, and yes, maybe even love. "No," she admitted. "It doesn't." "Then stay," James said. "Give us a real chance. 3 months to see if this is as real as we both think it is." Sarah pulled her hands back and buried her face in them. The practical part of her mind was screaming that this was insane. She barely knew this man. She couldn't just abandon her life in Ohio for someone she had met by accident. What would she tell her principal, her students, her family? But another part of her mind, a part that had been quiet for too long, was whispering something different. It was telling her that real love was rare and precious, and that people who were lucky enough to find it should be brave enough to fight for it. "I need time to think," Sarah said finally. "This is the biggest decision I've ever had to make." "Understand," James said, though she could see the disappointment in his eyes. "But Sarah, whatever you decide, I want you to know that meeting you has changed my life. Even if you leave on Sunday, even if we never see each other again, you've reminded me what it feels like to be truly happy." That night, Sarah lay awake in her hotel room, staring at the ceiling and trying to make the most important decision of her life. Stay in London with a man she was falling in love with, or return to the safety of her old life in Ohio. The clock ticked toward dawn, and Sarah knew that by Sunday, everything would change one way or another. Friday morning arrived gray and drizzly, matching Sarah's mood perfectly. She had spent the entire night wrestling with her decision, making mental lists of pros and cons, and imagining different versions of her future. By breakfast time, she had made up her mind 3 different ways. First, she decided she was being ridiculous and would definitely return to Ohio as planned. Then, she convinced herself that love was worth any risk and she should stay. Finally, she settled on a compromise. She would ask her principal for unpaid leave and see if it was possible to extend her stay without completely burning her bridges at home. But when she called her school, reality hit hard. The principal was understanding but firm. Sarah was needed for the new semester starting in 2 weeks. If she didn't return, they would have to find a replacement. There would be no job waiting for her if she changed her mind later. Sarah sat in her hotel room after the phone call, feeling more confused than ever. This wasn't just about taking a risk on love anymore. This was about potentially giving up her career, her security, and everything familiar for someone she had known for less than a week. She decided to spend the day exploring London one last time, hoping the city itself might help her find clarity. As she wandered through Hyde Park, watching families feed ducks and couples walk hand in hand, she thought about the life she had back in Ohio. It was a good life, but was it the life she really wanted? She had always played it safe, made practical choices, followed the path that made sense. But had she ever been truly happy? Had she ever felt as alive as she did when she was with James? That evening, Sarah met James at their usual pub. The moment she saw his face, she could tell he was as conflicted as she was. "I've been thinking all day," James said as they sat down, "and I realized I'm being selfish." Sarah's heart sank. "What do you mean?" I'm asking you to give up everything for me, while I'm not really giving up anything. I'm finishing my service in 3 months anyway. You're the one who would have to sacrifice your job, your home, your whole life." James looked down at his hands. "That's not fair, and it's not right." "James, no, let me finish. I care about you too much to ask you to risk everything for me. You should go back to Ohio. We can stay in touch, and maybe in a few months when I'm free to travel, I can come visit you. Can see if this is real without you having to give up your entire life." Sarah stared at him, feeling a mix of relief and disappointment. He was being practical, reasonable, and kind. He was also breaking her heart. "What if I want to take the risk?" she asked quietly. James looked up in surprise. "Do you?" Sarah took a deep breath. "I've been thinking too, about my life back home, about what makes me happy, about what I really want." She paused, gathering courage. "James, I love teaching, but I don't love my job. I'm good at what I do, but there are teaching jobs everywhere. What we have, what we found together, it's rare." "Sarah, you can't just—" "Yes, I can," she said firmly. "I'm 32 years old, and I've never taken a real risk in my life. I've never felt about anyone the way I feel about you. Maybe it won't work out. Maybe we'll discover we're not compatible in the long run. But maybe we'll discover something wonderful." James reached across the table and took her hands. "Are you sure? Really sure?" "I'm terrified," Sarah admitted with a laugh. "But yes, I'm sure. I called my principal today and I've already lost my job by not committing to come back. So in a way, the decision has been made for me. What about money? A place to stay? I have some savings and I can look for tutoring work or substitute teaching while I'm here. As for a place to stay," she smiled nervously. "I was hoping you might have some ideas about that." James's face broke into the biggest smile Sarah had ever seen. "I have a small flat in Camden. It's not much, but it's got a spare room you could use until we figure things out." "Just the spare room?" Sarah asked with raised eyebrows. James laughed. "We'll start with the spare room and see what happens." 3 months later, Sarah stood in the same spot outside Buckingham Palace where she had first crashed into James. But this time, she wasn't alone. James stood beside her, dressed in civilian clothes, his service with the Queen's Guard officially completed. They were planning their next adventure together, a trip to Ohio, so James could meet Sarah's family and see the American Midwest he had always been curious about. After that, they would return to London, where Sarah had found work at an international school and James had accepted a position with a private security firm. "Any regrets?" James asked, wrapping his arm around her shoulders. Sarah looked up at the palace. Thinking about that clumsy tourist who had stumbled backward into a royal guard just 3 months ago. That woman had been so worried about following rules and avoiding mistakes. This woman had learned that sometimes the best things in life came from the most unexpected accidents. "None," Sarah said, standing on her tiptoes to kiss the man who had changed her entire world. "Not a single one." As they walked away from Buckingham Palace together, both of them knew that their love story had begun with a simple apology and a surprising response. What started with "I'm sorry" had become "I love you," and that was the most beautiful surprise of all.